Chapter 22. Understand that this is not a deflection, I simply feel it appropriate to clarify something first. I am making it a point of practice. And, I suppose, principle. Not to take this opportunity to undercut the others in their absence, which obligates me to give full credit where I deem it deserved. He nodded, keeping his posture still and his expression open, and she turned to face him directly. T.Iris does value mortal lives, and would take great offense if you suggested otherwise in her hearing. In the course of her long life she has several times lived among mortals for extended periods, and come to value many as comrades and friends. But she respects strength, and in particular, the will to seek it out, to hone and to wield it. I do not know the details, but I have observed over the years that she has seemed to be waiting for something, or perhaps seeking something, and growing increasingly frustrated when it failed to appear. As the cultures of the Evervals develop as you just noted, passively, fatalistically, with a presumed helplessness that impels them to flee and hide rather than fight, T.Iris has gradually lost respect for and interest in them. To know more in any detail you would need to ask her, husband, but I do urge you not to dismiss her out of hand. Of course, he agreed. Thank you for the perspective. As for Malafine, Izaroa pursed her lips in annoyance. Doubtless it is not lost on you that we tend to butt heads, husband, so to recognize my bias and judge accordingly. Of Malafine, I can definitely say that she holds no malice toward mortals, a contrast which has long been very meaningful to me, as Atraximos actively despised all races but his own, with particular contempt for those with shorter lives and less of personal power. It has stuck in my throat somewhat because he tried to instill the same in his children. And? Did he succeed at that? Cullen asked very carefully. She made a wry little grimace. Fortunately not. None of them have ever cared for his opinion on any subject beyond knowing how to avoid setting off his temper. The dismissal with which he treated his own consorts and offspring ruled out any possibility of ever instilling his own values in any of us. To you and I, husband, that might seem an obvious outcome, but it is a lesson frequently lost on dragons. And upon being similarly born into great power which requires no particular self-discipline to exercise. I see, he said, nodding again. Malafine is simply not interested in mortals. I do know she lived among them for a time in her youth, as many dragons do. Hers is not an act of disdain, but merely detachment. Immortals of any kind are often prone to that. I would imagine, he agreed, if you see entire generations rise and fall over the course of your own life, it must start to seem pointless to get attached. Even painful. We do have a different relationship with time, though it is perhaps a bit more complex than that. But in any case, you asked about me. I suppose it is more than enough waffling. Cullen stepped forward, reaching out to gently take her hand, which she allowed. At the risk of repeating myself, I'm not here to judge, not the others, and certainly not you, Izaroa. More than any of them, in your case I assumed there must be explanations for anything which confuses me, if you deign to share them. I really only want to understand. You have not offended me, husband, she assured him quietly, squeezing his hands. I flatter myself that I have sufficient character to give a reasonable account for my own actions. Still, she hesitated another moment, and Cullen stepped backward, gently pulling her along. Out of the echoing gold-trimmed marble of the bathroom and into the much cozier bedchamber. I fear, she said at last, directly a thoughtful frown at him, that the ease with which you dispatched him may have damaged your understanding of the sheer physical threat Atraximos posed. Well, I am aware of history. He's been a fact of life in this part of the world for so long that I can't even imagine how civilization will adjust to his absence. But less an intimate threat to you than anyone raised in the Evervals. Despite how it may have seemed, Atraximos was a defensive thinker, primarily. The focus of his spells, his pacts, even the artifacts he tended to collect, all his efforts were bent toward rendering himself invulnerable rather than developing mastery or might, as Malafine and T.Iris did, for example. He was a living, flying citadel. Even the most basic weapons of a dragon are sufficient to devastate an empire, if the dragon in question is all but untouchable. None of us could have destroyed him in combat. I honestly don't believe any dragon currently alive could, nor any but a very few of the gods. The three of us together, had we decided to turn on him, well, that would have been an uncomfortably close thing. I, for my part, never dared raise the idea, for if even one of the other consorts chose to side with him, the result would have been decisive defeat for the rebels. For countless years now I have been waiting for another power to rise which would overwhelm him. I have lived long enough to know that one always does. That is the way of the world. She smiled at him, a complex expression that was wry and sad, yet also genuinely amused. Letting go of his hand, she turned and strolled to the window, pushing back the gilt-edged velvet brocade curtains. The window looked out over the street in front of the Renaissance, and for some reason it had iron bars on the outside, as if this were a prison. And strangely enough, that's not even how it happened. Atraximos himself created the one, incredibly specific thing that could destroy him. Because that is essentially what happens to a powerful being which attacks a godling at the moment of their apotheosis. All the limitless potential of creation itself, pointed suddenly at one implacable goal: obliterate this dragon. I don't know how to overstate the incredible rarity and specificity of what happened between the two of you. In any conventional attack I could imagine, no matter who you are or what power you possessed, I don't believe you could have prevailed. Are you concerned about me getting a big head? Colm asked, smiling. She turned back to face him, not smiling. No, husband. I am concerned about you thinking me a coward. I do not, he said without hesitation, holding her gaze. I understand what you were dealing with. Surely not to the extent you do, but intellectually. I grasped the situation. Even if I hadn't promised not to judge you, Izyroa, for this I definitely would not. Her shoulders slumped faintly in a soft sigh, and she gave him a weak smile, moving slowly back toward the center of the room. She seated herself gracefully on one side of a velvet-padded love seat, and Colm stepped over to join her. And so it was. Atraximos had just destroyed Valerald, taking all the lands of the old empire as his hunting ground. Worse, he ensconced himself in a lair practically on its southern border. Were it to become the center of his range, it would easily encompass my Rivak. There was no question I could defeat him in a confrontation. With the full resources of my empire and the combined strength of the 9. At best, we had a coin flip's odds of forcing him back, leaving us sharing a border with a hostile dragon of immense power. And even that much was far from assured. The prospect of defeat and devastation was very real. So, as does every nation unable to protect itself through physical force, I resorted to diplomacy. She looked resolute now, and calm, but seemed reluctant to meet Colm's eyes again. He reached across and took one of her hands. She not only allowed it, but squeezed his fingers as she continued. You have likely already observed that dragons living in a family unit are jealous of our individual territories, and any such unit stable enough to survive is built on respect for the territory. The only way for me to keep Atraximos out of Rivak was for him to acknowledge it as mine, which would only matter to him if I acknowledged myself as his. And so, I made the choice a ruler must. Izyroa lifted her head again, meeting Colm's eyes. I assure you, husband, I know very well the damage we have done to these lands. I know it, and I feel the weight. But nowhere in that burden is regret. I am an empress, and I protected my people. In an ideal world, all affairs between nations would be built upon cooperation and mutual benefit. In the world that exists, one realm's prosperity often comes at another's expense, and it is the sworn duty of a ruler to do what is best for their people, even if others must suffer for it. By protecting Rivak, I condemned the Avervals. That is the choice with which I must live, resolute in the knowledge that I could have made no other. He could see it in her face, in her eyes, even in their disguised state, the certainty she spoke of, but also the grief at what she had deemed the necessity. And somehow, Though she was unimpeachably poised as always, something in her aspect was vulnerable in a way he had never seen on her, nor even imagined. Despite the screaming in the back of his head that he was being presumptuous and offensive, Colin embraced the first impulse he had, shifting closer to her on the love seat. He turned and wrapped his arms around her, picking her up and moving her into his lap. Izaroa looked surprised at this sudden handling, but didn't resist or object. And in fact, once he had her settled and embraced her tightly with both arms, she leaned into him with a soft sigh, resting her forehead in the crook of his neck. "I am in no way competent to weigh these choices against each other," Colin murmured. "What I can tell you is that I grew up in Rivkabad, an orphan, someone whom I am well aware would likely have ended up begging for scraps on the streets in more countries than otherwise. I was given an upbringing and an education, a chance at a life, because of the standards you created. So were countless others. I won't argue Rivak is perfect. Gods know I've had my own problems with certain of its systems. But as one of your people, Izaroa, I can tell you with my whole heart that you have done well by us. We prosper, and thrive, and even in our failures and the darkest corners of our civilization we are better off than the people of many other nations. We know, and appreciate, whose guiding hand we have to thank for it. Whatever harm you've done, you have also succeeded brilliantly, and made all the difference for countless souls." She began twisting in his grasp, her motions suddenly awkward and frantic in a way they hadn't been even during sex, but far from trying to escape him, she was turning to clutch him directly. The position seemed probably uncomfortable for her lower back, but then, dragons were probably more durable and flexible than humans. Still sitting sideways across his lap, she pressed her chest against his, embracing him tightly, and buried her face in his neck. "Thank you, Colin." He held her, pressing a kiss to the riot of curls atop her head, and gently rocked them back and forth for a while. Colin was actually relieved a short time later when they left the opulent suite. He was still so unaccustomed to wealth as to be actively uncomfortable in its presence. The dragon's hoard and the vast quantity of coin currently tucked in his bag of holding were one thing, they were outside the scope of what he considered normal life, almost alien. That set of rooms were designed for mortals like himself, people whose understanding of the world seemed even more orthogonal to his own than the dragon's. "Tomorrow, we shall go to the Merchant Guild I recommend. It is a bit late in the day, and I don't want to risk having to break up our business across 2 sessions, or being out and about past dark. This city is somewhat less orderly than Rivkabad." "Are you worried for our safety?" he asked teasingly. Izaroa gave him a little smirk. "I am worried about the unnecessary complications that may begin to spiral if I am forced to address any untoward attentions aimed at us. More to the point, do you really think our business with the merchants will take that long? In fact, I am possibly applying excessive caution. No, I don't really expect to be that long occupied with them. It's more that our specific errand there is somewhat outside my experience. I've bought individual artworks and artifacts from them, not arranged consistent deliveries of prosaic foodstuffs. Truly I doubt it could possibly take more than a few hours, but by indulging in an abundance of consideration we gain a free evening tonight. And after all, I have 2 additional purposes for this trip." "Oh, 2? First and foremost, I have promised to indulge you most shamelessly, husband," she said, glancing coyly up at him, then lifting their joint hands so she could kiss his. "A great metropolis Boisford may not be, but it should provide ample resources for me to show you a good time. And in addition to that, I wish to indulge my curiosity about how the current regime runs things." "Ah, a professional interest," he said, nodding. "Well, obviously I won't be able to appreciate the details to the extent you will, but I confess to some intellectual curiosity along the same lines. You needn't worry, I hardly expect to be bored." "Indeed you shall not be, husband, for I believe I know exactly where to find the answer to both goals, conveniently together." Colin blinked, trying to fathom what she could possibly be hinting at and coming up blank. She gave him another of those looks, sly and amused. It was definitely a departure, her being short enough to look up at him through her rich lashes, but he didn't hate it. "You, my love, are a tease. I seem to recall teaching you an appreciation for that quality last night." It was an observation, not a complaint. She laughed and he basked in the pure happiness of her musical alto mirth washing over him. They stepped off the staircase and around the corner, passing the front desk where the concierge smiled and bowed to them, and from there it was but a few more paces to the front door. As before, the diffident servant opened and held it for them, bowing. Again, following Isaro's lead, Colin stepped past without glancing at or acknowledging him. It felt rude, even knowing that here, to do otherwise would have been the offense. Outside there was nothing comparable to the carriage area adjacent to the market. There just wasn't room on this street. However, Colin now noticed that there were several of those distinctive black two-wheeled horse-drawn vehicles parked at the sides of the street here and there, carefully positioned not to obstruct any of the doors. Isaiah headed right to the nearest of these, as before climbing into the seat without speaking to the driver first. "A lovely afternoon to a lovely lord and lady," said the driver, a bluff-faced woman with a flat black hat like Fortiro had worn, turning and tugging down the brim in their direction. "And where had we a fancy to visit today, eh?" "Tell me," said Isaiah, "where in Boisford do then he congregate?" Colin managed not to outwardly betray startlement at this question. The driver seemed to find nothing untoward about it in the slightest. "Ah, you want the roundabout." She flicked the reins and the horse pulled them forward, out into the street. "Just making conversation, or have I started us in the right direction?" "That sounds perfect, thank you," Isaiah answered smoothly. "Tell me, what sort of place is this roundabout?" If their driver found it odd that they wanted to go somewhere without having any idea what they'd find, she continued not to show it. "Entertainment district. Just the place for a pair of well-heeled travelers such as yourselves to let down your hair a bit for the evening. And you two'll be proper popular, I should think. Coin's coin and a professional doesn't discriminate, but then you're known to have a soft spot for pretty people. Also for Imperials. You be in from the Southlands, eh? However you want to pass the time, you'll find it there. Public houses, theaters, all manner of specialty shops, brothels, even a couple casinos, dance halls." "Ah, so then he work chiefly as entertainers in Boisford, then? Anything else?" "In many places, they are widely associated with theft and violence." "Aye, so I hear. Picking up foreign travelers as I do. Seems downright odd to my ears. Really, then criminals. I guess being nimble would be of use in picking pockets or windowsills, but nah. They're small, they're cute, they've no magic and they're perpetual outsiders. Folk like that are usually the best behaved in town, not the worst. Anytime ruffians get riled up, Nia and the like are the easiest targets. Doesn't suit 'em to make themselves unpopular, see? So this is a safe district, then? Colin asked. Isaiah shot him an amused look, which he tried to bear with good humor. Oh, you can count on that, Lord. Then you don't stand for any shenanigans. Their livelihood depends on people with coin feeling secure enough to come spend it. First hint o' trouble and they run right for the city watch. Since you're new to our fair city, I'll give you some free advice. If you wanna stay safe, look to the coach drivers. She turned to grin at them. Don't go anywhere a coachee refuses to take you, or anywhere a coachee seems weirdly insistent on taking you without being asked first. Follow those two rules and you'll be as safe in Boisford as anyone can expect to be in these lands. We thank you for that excellent advice, Isaiah said gravely. All part of the service, laddie. This is encouraging so far, Isaiah added more quietly. Colin leaned toward her, lowering his voice. Why are you so interested in Hiya? Again she smirked at him. Tell me, husband, did you often interact with them in Rivkabad? I mean, now and then, I had to visit markets and government offices the same as anyone. You meet all sorts of folk. I never found reason to go to the dockside district where they mostly live in Rivkabad. Are they well thought of, in the city? He took note that her expression had sobered markedly, and answered her with all due seriousness. I've heard the same rumors you just mentioned, but never any credible accounts of Nhia crime rings. They tend to hold themselves a bit apart as a culture, and that inevitably leads to rumor. I certainly was never aware of any widespread sentiment against them. Rivkabad is very pluralist, just as... He paused, glancing at the driver's back. The Empress wished. The Nhia are fine. Just people, like any other group. Even if talking to them can be exasperating. She chuckled, leaning her head against his shoulder, and he draped an arm around her, increasingly curious what the plan here was. The roundabout seemed to be a hill. Or maybe it was the architecture rather than the terrain, or possibly both. In any case, it was a whole, vertical district, the gables and spires typical of Verdi architecture rising ever higher to a noticeable peak from a towering structure in the center, an enormous clock tower. Or what had been one, once. The round faces on four sides still had glass in spots, bracketed in place by wrought iron, but the roof was long gone, and its surviving stonework charred black. Not hard to guess what had happened here. The area where the clockwork had been now seemed to be a rooftop space, blazing with light and activity. In fact, the whole district stood out from its surroundings due to light and color. It had lamps on even in the broad daylight, and stained glass in many windows that would make the whole place light up like a riotous rainbow in the darkness. Bright pennants and banners were hung everywhere, further enlivening the view. It seemed the actual street into the roundabout was too narrow for the coach, so they were dropped off outside with a cheery farewell, the cheerier after Isaroa overpaid for their ride. It left them only with a short walk to the entrance, which their driver hadn't wanted to obstruct. Colin was interested to see how obviously an entrance it was, rather than just another intersection. There was a double gateway separating off the roundabout's main street, divided by a small tower which protruded slightly into the square outside. There were no actual gates under the stone arches, just colorful banners above and strings of paper lanterns just out of reach overhead. And in the gates were the touts. Colin was familiar with the type from Rivkabad's entertainment districts, though back home none of those seemed to have a racial predominance. But there they were, calling out, flirting, handing out flowers and flyers and generally trying to entice customers into their domain. It was interesting to him that rather than individual establishments posting individual touts to recruit passers-by outside their own doors, these seemed to be collectively pitching the entertainment district itself. So they must have some degree of organization here. Because, aside from their cooperation, they were all Nhia. Just as he remembered them from back home. Shorter on average than humans and slimmer of build, they mostly looked human, except for the furry triangular ears atop their heads, and their fluffy tails. As he and Isaroa drew closer, he could see their elongated canines and vertically slitted pupils, rather like a dragon's, though that comparison wouldn't have occurred to him before. And then the pair of them were spotted, and swarmed. Welcome. Welcome to Uwiam of enchantment and excitement. Ooh, please take this. Awarvui for woofo awarvui young coop. You we just too pretty to Steve be so boo at this who? I know just the place to get that fixed. Be so to visit the pop-ad. If everybody needs a massage, coop's welcome. Fo cuties like you too, though be a nice discount. Are you visiting us? Yay! I'm so excited. We wove gorgeous friends like you. Yep, they did that in Felvalin as well as V. Colin put on a smile as a garland of flowers was draped around his neck. Isaroa laughed in seeming delight, squeezing his hand, as a crown of them was set atop her hair. Surrounded by cute, eager, feline entertainers, they were ushered into the district for a night of, well, hopefully fun. He could already tell he was going to need a drink. Chapter 23 Paradoxically, escaping from the State Avenue outside into the comparatively raucous entertainment district bought them some peace and quiet, just because nobody here was paying attention to the pair of them directly, yet. With Colin and Isaiah on the hook and into their domain, then he touts went back to catcalling other passers-by. Colin was immediately fascinated by the contrast that was everywhere, the fundamental duality of this district. Everything was built in the Verdi style, with heavy grey stone and dark timber embellished with intricate carvings and ornamental ironwork, bristling with spires and gables and buttresses up at the level of the steep roofs, themselves consistently tiled with dark slate. It was an aesthetic at once elaborate and grim, and then he had embellished it with the opposite. They liked bright colors and simple patterns. The stained glass added to upper windows, and even some of the street lamps weren't made into meglass-inspired artistic forms as had been at the Renaissance, but simple panels of color through which lights beamed to cast crazy rainbows everywhere. They'd hung up flowers both fresh and dried, and some, he noted, made of cloth that would bloom even in the winter, and there were pennants and banners everywhere. Hanging from windowsills, attached to the sides of buildings, dangling from ropes strung across the street, and often with no CGO or even pattern, just put up to add splashes of color. It was in the people, too, the contrast between the Verdi customers thronging the street and the exuberant he loudly soliciting their attention. That contrast was lesser, though, as whatever local sensibilities prevailed seemed to have relaxed somewhat on a street dedicated to fun and carousing. They were mostly local, pale humans with hair ranging from brown to copper to blonde. Colin did see a few people with darker complexions who might have been Riva, and there was a dwarf on the patio of a nearby establishment flirting with Tunisia waitresses. One and all, though, they looked relaxed and happy. From what he knew of entertainment districts in general, that just indicated that it was, after all, only late afternoon, and nobody in the vicinity was properly drunk yet. "Ah, this seems to be a splendid variety of amenities," Isaiah commented. "Public houses, food stalls, and restaurants, and it's only within our field of view from right here. The Renaissance has an excellent in-house restaurant, catering primarily to guests. I had quite hoped to treat you there, husband. But then, we can always have dinner there tomorrow night. Would you like to eat here this evening, or cut short our visit after an hour or two and return to our lodgings?" "I must plead ignorance," Colin said smoothly, turning to her with his most winning smile. "Besides, quite apart from your greater familiarity with the area, it was you who had a secondary purpose in visiting here tonight. Why don't you take the lead? I cannot conceive that anything you might show me would be less than splendid, if not in its own right, then by virtue of your company." He raised her hand to give her palm a courtly kiss, gazing warmly into her eyes. Unlike previous times, her smile diminished by a hair. Colin experienced a sudden stab of alarm, a flashback to a similar moment with Tiavathyris, in which her warm and increasingly inviting hints had suddenly flipped into disappointed rejection. Without even meaning to, he found himself focusing on Isaiah with his full dragon-related power just as he had then, desperate to understand what he'd done wrong, to fix it before he blew this entirely. As before, it wasn't as if he could read her thoughts, just sense a general shape of emotions. Unlike Tiavathyris, hers were calm, with no upset he could discern. She was focused, and what was that sensation, the peculiar mirror of his own outward presentation? Feeling it reflected back at him was oddly disorienting. Empathy. "That is not merely a practice, for you, is it?" Isaiah asked softly. "You do have quite the knack for getting what you want, husband. Make yourself a source of pleasure to others and they will often seek to please you in turn. But suddenly, I find myself wondering, is that actually the only way you know to relate to someone important to you?" Colin took refuge in poise, barely. He had no prepared response for this, nothing in his repertoire that gave him any precedent for what was happening here, much less what to do about it. All he could manage was to remain outwardly calm, to keep his flirtatious front in place. "And what's the harm with that approach? I bring happiness to others, and if I do it well, gain some for myself. Rare in life is the choice with no downside. I hardly find cause for complaint." Power swelled in her. Already focusing on her with his full draconic senses, Colin didn't need to concentrate further this time to understand what she was doing. The magic ensured them privacy even in this crowd, both deflecting attention from their conversation and garbling their words should anyone happen to overhear. "It is a fine tactic," Isaroa said, staring up at him, her eyes calm but intense. "Even a strategy. But as a way of life, it is beneath you, the man you are capable of being. It has been unavoidable for me to read between the lines, husband. I have not asked about your past or the suffering that impelled you on the path to me. Nor will I. You will share that with me when you deem it time, and I will be honored by your trust when I have earned it. But the shape of it, the broad nature, that it has been impossible not to intuit." She reached up, first touching his cheek with her soft fingertips, itself an oddly incongruous sensation, as he kept expecting the cold hard claws that were so much an integral part of her. Then, though, she slid her hand around, brushing back a few stray locks of his hair, over his ear, and finally caressing his neck. "The past is the past. You are no one's plaything, Arkansas Colin Zellicur, and never shall be again. I am. We are what we are. The potential I see in you, the will you hesitate to embrace, the inclination to impose yourself, to take what is yours without apology? Neither I nor your other consorts fear it. We are accustomed to it. We are inclined to value it." He wasn't quite sure how to interpret the rising pressure in his chest, much less what to do about it. For now, he just stared down into his wife's eyes as she gazed back at him. Then, subtly, licked her lips in a fleeting little gesture that sent a stab of heat through his consciousness. "This is something you will need to do, to fulfill your role in our family," she said, her voice quiet but assertive. "It is the thing that will make your skill at pleasing us an asset and not a mark of weakness. But more than that, it is something we need, that I need, and appreciate. Your ability, your willingness to declare what will please you, and command it to be done." She had shifted by that point to be standing directly in front of him, so close they both had to tilt their heads to lock eyes. Slowly, Isaroa slid her hand down the side of his face, his neck, to rest it lightly against his shoulder. When she spoke again, it was a whisper. "Command me, husband." Before deciding he was going to, Colin had pulled her into his arms. She was pliant and warm and wondrously soft, reaching up to embrace his neck as she yielded to him and raised her face expectantly. The kiss was barely restrained by them both. He wanted to devour her, to crush her lips with his own, to drive her into the pavement right there and drink in her beauty and receptiveness until he burst from it. She rewarded him with soft murmurs of appreciation as her lips opened to welcome him in. In every squeeze and tiny wriggle he could feel her matching eagerness, rising to meet and meld with his own frantic energy, even as they mutually held back. They sort of had to. They were standing in the middle of a public street, and the magic that repelled interest and intrusion into their conversation clearly did not make them invisible, to judge by the chorus of whooping and catcalls which erupted from all sides, most in shrill Nhia accents. Everything Colin understood about himself as a person told him that should have left him poleaxed with mortification, but on the contrary. If anything it spurred him on further. Squeezing Isaroa, he lifted her bodily off the pavement and spun her in a circle even as she squealed into his lips. She was his, and he didn't care if everyone. No, he wanted everyone to see it. There was, however, a limited number of seconds they could keep that up and not have to either pull back or go urgently in search of privacy. And, after all, they'd come here for a purpose. They had a lovely suite back at the Renaissance for that. With deep regret, but still firmly, Colin gently pushed her away to catch his breath, taking great satisfaction in her wordless little murmur of protest, the reluctance with which she allowed herself to be put at a greater distance. The way her lips clung to his until he finally created enough space to look her in the eyes again. Colin wordlessly stroked her cheek with the backs of his fingers, then lifted his hand again to graze her temple, lightly ruffling curls that were too thick and tight to actually wind his hand into. He playfully tweaked her nose and caught her chin for just a second between fingertip and thumb. and all the while his wife, his proud and ancient empress, beamed up at him in warm delight at being thus playfully handled like a kept concubine. "We'll dine at the Renaissance tomorrow night," Colin declared. "I wouldn't want to miss that, since you so recommend it, so it can be our treat after we finish business tomorrow. For now, we are here. It would be a shame not to explore, no?" She blinked once, languidly, and dipped her head in acknowledgement. "As you wish, husband." Colin kept an arm around her, sliding it down to encircle her waist and pulling her against his side as he stepped further into the roundabout. Now, the awkwardness was beginning to settle on him as his blood managed to cool slightly. They still had an audience, and while the local humans appeared to be trying to ignore them, there were lingering wolf whistles and commentary from some of the nearby Leah. "Oh, don't stop. Dip you. I wanna pray. Can't I be in the mid of that? You two want a job? That was a betcha the new opening act. I had that, Kifney." He risked a glance down at Iziroa, who looked. Actually, rather than uncomfortable, she seemed openly proud of herself. Colin marshaled his own public face and tried for a more serene indifference, since he doubted he could pull off her level of self-satisfaction. "Before today," he asked, "when was the last time you indulged in street food?" "Oh, that's a question. I legitimately have no idea, Colin. It's been likely long enough that the recipes have all changed." "Perfect." He tugged her diagonally across the street toward the nearest stand. "I have missed it. No disrespect to the restaurants here, but we can indulge in our formal sit-down meals back at the inn. Tonight feels like a good opportunity to graze as we go." "I like that idea, husband. What with one thing and another, I believe we both deserve a vacation from our various responsibilities." Colin had picked the stall at random, but as they came close enough to see clearly he discerned that the snack on offer was stuffed peppers, the roasted vegetables packed with a melange of mincemeat and spices. The recent memory of their lamb skewers wasn't enough to stop his stomach from rumbling in anticipation. His senses, those not distracted by the prospect of food, were still filled with Iziroa, and he not only sensed but easily interpreted an on-the-fly modification to the spell she kept over them, protecting their privacy from eavesdropping but enabling them to deliberately communicate with others. Colin didn't know enough about magic to guess how difficult that was, but it seemed suitably complicated to be impressive. "Two, please," he said politely to the man behind the stall. "Ah, good choice," the fellow said cheerfully, showing off pointed fangs in a grin even as he wrapped 2 peppers in wax paper. "You two started with spicy and sweet, so now you single quote WWB wanting servoy? I hope you bought enough for everybody, because I so did." Iziroa laughed in evidently sincere amusement. Colin cleared his throat awkwardly, but couldn't help grinning along as he exchanged coins for peppers. "I won't hold it against you if they're less savory than what I just had, nothing possibly could be." "I'm sure she'd say the same, cutie," the pepper seller replied with a flirtatious wink. "We've some sexy for the west of us, you two. Oh, won't you? We needed folk." Colin retreated as gracefully as he could manage, distracting himself by taking a bite of his pepper and handing Iziroa hers. It was small enough that there wouldn't be more than 2 bites, 3 if he savored it. At the first, though, he actually faltered a step, wincing in sheer delight. Oh, this was a spicy pepper, but mildly so, and still noticeably sweet. The ground meat was pork, and padded out with bits of potato and onion, all held together with a thick, smoky sauce. Magnificent. MMMF, Iziroa agreed, beaming up at him as she chewed. Colin could sort of see her earlier point, of her expression now was anything like his back then. It was a pure delight to watch someone to lovely experience something so delicious. Now this, husband, was an excellent idea. I knew following your lead was the right choice here. That's good to hear. Now I have someone to blame if I lead us off a cliff. She laughed and bumped her hip against him, popping the rest of her stuffed pepper into her mouth. Colin took time to finish his off before continuing. So, I see theaters as well as a lot of stores. Let's reserve judgment in case we happen across a really compelling performance, but for now I feel inclined to wander and browse. We can do some shopping while we pick up nibbles here and there from the stands. How's that sound? Like the best afternoon I'll have spent in ages, my love. There's nothing quite so relaxing as aimless wandering. I am curious, though. Excuse me, young lady. She paused to address the occupant of the nearest stand, an Hiya girl selling flowers, who perked up in apparent delight at being addressed. Oh, whoa, what's this? A pretty waddy desires my attention. Take me, I'm yours. I'm afraid my dance card is filled, my dear, Isaroa replied, smiling. So I see. The young woman's slitted eyes darted up and down Colin and her tail waved in the air behind her. Are you two working for a theed? I'm not in the twade, to be qual, it's just that we both so Whitaco is why hot. Not that isn't tempting, Colin said, playing along, but I fear I couldn't give you the attention you deserve, not when she commands so much of mine. I can see how she would, the girl agreed, now brazenly eyeballing Isaroa. Something about her, like a lot of the Hiya, was just so ridiculous that he couldn't manage to feel either jealous or tempted. She was just putting on an outgoing performance to coax some coin out of them, of course. As had been the pepper seller, and the touts back at the entrance. Then again, a lot of the surrounding Hiya seemed to be like this, including those who had cheered and whistled their kiss without trying to sell them anything. Back in Revkabot Colin had only encountered Hiya alone or in small groups, and always by chance while they were on other business. He had never been surrounded by them in their own territory before. Was this just how they were? Cheerful, outgoing and horny. What is the building at the top of the hill? Isaroa asked. The one this street seems to lead to? Ooh, you mean the Queen. A fine place to spend you time and you coin. They have everything, food and drink, dancing, gaming tabs, performances of all kinds. Not to mention private rooms, and a what of the staff are viewing to join you in them. Not fof we, usual why, and on if they will why like you. She once again eyed them up, both in turn this time, and licked her lips. Something tells me you'd be a hit. Alright, you win, Colin said indulgently. What's the most expensive thing you have? Ooh, me. I hardly eat anything and I'm very bendy. Less than a minute later they were back on their way, Isaroa with an amazingly intricate flower crown perched atop her curls and Colin with a matching corsage attached to his shoulder. Okay, I'll admit it, he murmured, grateful that her privacy enchantment was still in place. That's going to get old real fast. Do you know what their native language is like? I'm trying to imagine what sort of accent seems to result in baby talk. Surely they can't be doing it on purpose, not if they're fishing for money. That's a lot more annoying than it is cute. The closest thing than Hiya have to a racial language is nonverbal, Isaroa said just as softly, matching his languid pace as they sauntered along, people watching and window shopping. And that's more a set of codes than a full dialect. Actually, husband, it's not so much an accent as a speech impediment. Feline anatomy, you know. Feline. He looked down at her in surprise. I mean, I noticed the ears and tails, obviously. And the eyes and teeth. It's not just that, specifically, it's oral anatomy. Hiya have blunt-tipped tongues with a rough texture and concave upper surface, and the roofs of their mouths are both highly arched and ridged. It's very difficult for them, physically, to produce sounds that are articulated by regulating the flow of air between the top of the tongue and roof of the mouth. Really? Colin was suddenly intrigued in spite of himself, and also a little ashamed for poking fun. So. LLLLL. Huh. Somehow, all his use of language at the professional level had never called for much investigation into the anatomical origins of phonetics. Isaroa gave him an amused look up through her lashes while he experimented with sounds, but for the comment. They paused with a crowd of other tourists, watching and listening to a very skilled Hiya man playing a fiddle while two women danced exuberantly around him, the whole performance taking up the entirety of a stone platform which formed an elevated island in the middle of the street. This really was a fully dedicated entertainment district, if they could enjoy everything including the performing arts without having to go inside for a sit-down performance. "8.HOARD is doing well," Isaiah said quietly, eyes still on the performers, despite everything. Colin looked down at her distant expression, then back at the dancers, thinking. "You wanted to investigate the condition of the country, as well as find some entertainment," he said, squeezing her close and rubbing the side of her waist. "I think I understand. Because the Hiya are perpetual outsiders wherever they go, aren't they? Disliked in a lot of places, considered beggars and thieves and disease carriers. So it speaks well of this culture, that they are embraced." "That is part of it, husband." She looked up at him with a smile, then leaned her head against his shoulder, her curls and the flowers resting in them tickling his cheek. "It is about more than culture, though. Such easily identifiable outsider groups are very tempting targets, for a regime interested in its own power above all. Incompetent leadership results in bad conditions for the poorer classes, and a great deal of public anger. It is terrifyingly easy to redirect that anger away from its genuine cause, and toward more vulnerable targets. The gambit is too easy and too predictably successful to be passed up by rulers with even slightly malignant intentions. In any country suffering any significant burden of corruption, one also finds small, vulnerable outgroups being actively persecuted. Not just in Hiya, but they are a universal target for it wherever a population of them exists. They are easily, immediately identifiable, and their inability to do magic not only leaves them vulnerable but provides a pretext. Many regimes have claimed they are rejected by the gods. The fiddler finished up with a flourish, as did the dancers, whose final pose was half wrapped around each other, nose to nose and staring into each other's eyes with notable heat for 2 seconds before they turned to the applauding crowd and swept elaborate bows. Colin was impressed in spite of himself, and despite how deeply inappropriate all this was to Reva's sensibilities. He wasn't even sure how socially acceptable it was to the Verdi. Everybody here had come specifically to carouse. He had learned more about the Hiya in the last 5 minutes from Isaiah than in the entirety of his previous life, and certainly couldn't claim to understand them in any detail. It was impossible to say whether they were just congenitally randy as alley cats as a culture, or deliberately playing it up for the audience, but he strongly suspected there were elements of both. Colin had never imagined anyone could make fiddle music seem erotic, but there they were. While the other onlookers applauded and he added his own handful of coins to those being tossed into the violin case in front of the performers, Isaiah continued in a tone just barely loud enough to be audible to him over the nearby tumult. "I do know the throne of 8.HOARD changed hands less than a decade ago. The new royal house will have barely had time to fully establish itself. Just how successful they are remains to be seen, but it appears they are trying, in good faith, to care for their people. It warms my heart to see. Like any professional, I hate to watch my craft ineptly performed." Colin looked at his wife's expression, then up at a clear evening sky free of dragons, and gathered her up in a hug. Chapter 24. It took an ironic amount of effort to relax, or at least, to remember how. Colin had spent a couple of days in wonder and discovery constantly tinged with the need to manage his bizarre new situation under pressures he didn't fully understand. Before that had been a year of toil and deprivation, eking out bare survival on a mission fueled by pure spite, goaded along by possibly the most manifestly suspicious being in the cosmos. And before that, well, his last days in Revkabit had been in a prison, expecting an expedient knife from the dark as his only reprieve from grieving how the people he'd most loved and trusted had put him in that situation. He had to look quite a long way back to dredge up memories of just goofing off. But they were there. Colin had spent countless hours of his youth faffing around the Duck Market and Feathered Steps districts, first in the company of fellow foundlings raised through the civil service program, then fellow scribes, and eventually an eclectic group of friends he'd picked up on the course of these little adventures. He knew how to patronize bars and shops and food stalls, just relaxing, enjoying the ambience and the company. And once he got back into the rhythm of it, this was so much better. Instead of scribes and other higher-class riffraff, he was in the company of his gorgeous, fascinating new wife. Instead of the leftovers after living expenses of a young civil servant's wages, he had an effectively bottomless quantity of coin. Yeah, in fact it was hard to even describe how much better this was. They wandered, browsed, snacked and chatted without purpose, just letting the roundabout take them wherever it went, and taking in whatever they found there. Isaroa seemed to take it as given that she'd buy whatever caught her fancy in any shop they patronized, which at first appalled Cullen's frugal sensibilities, but he got over it quickly. Having bags of holding that not only held unfathomable amounts of money but offered them infinite carrying capacity, there was nothing at all to inhibit their spending. They picked up everything from tea and candy to clothing and pottery, and always at the asking price, without haggling. It took very little of this for the two of them to become immensely popular among the shopkeepers, who were clearly forewarned as they made their way up the street and began sending scantily clad Nhia attendants of both sexes out to intercept and coax them in, and once inside, plied them with so many sweets and snacks and drinks that they ended up not buying any more food on their way up the street. His intuitive understanding of any spell his wife cast got very interesting over the course of the evening. 7 times that Cullen counted, Isaroa, with no outward sign that she was doing anything, sent out pulses of magic that targeted and left in a state of helpless befuddlement individuals who'd begun to follow them with less hospitable intentions. None of them Nhia, interestingly. Well, it was surely preferable to leaving someone in a pile of giblets in an alley. Not that Cullen had much sympathy for bandits, but it was hard not to feel a little bad for someone just trying to scrape by in a rough country who accidentally ambushed a dragon. Better for everyone if nothing came to a head in the first place. Though they ended up not patronizing any more food stalls, there were many street performers paced strategically along the route, separated just enough that they didn't interfere with one another. Musicians, a puppet show, some kind of call-and-response comedy duo that seemed a little too culturally specific for Cullen to quite get, and dancers of all kinds, including a nearly nude trio of Nhia acrobats who clambered about on spinning poles, obviously showing off their bodies at least as much as their athleticism. They had, unsurprisingly, the largest crowd. Cullen and Isaroa stopped for at least a few minutes at each little show, and tossed a few coins at the appropriate moments. "Just so we are clear, husband," Isaroa murmured after the 3rd time he politely declined a pushy invitation into an obvious brothel, "none of your consorts are prone to jealousy." He gave her an aggressively skeptical look, at which she grinned in amusement. "Very well, I phrased that poorly. If any of us begins to think we are receiving a lesser share of your attention than that to which we feel entitled, there will be issues. But beyond that, we won't begrudge whatever else you choose to do with your free time. If you wish to dally here and there, or even keep a mortal concubine or several, that in and of itself should cause no affront." Cullen, not being a complete idiot, wasn't even touching that. "Good to know, but right now, I am here with you." He looped his arm back around her waist, tugging her close, which she rewarded with a delighted smile and an exuberant little snuggle. "And you are more than worth my full attention, lady wife. You can't just flaunt yourself under my nose and expect me to find anyone else even slightly interesting." "You really are good at that," she said approvingly. "I'd best be careful, husband, lest you have a deleterious effect on my ego." He wasn't touching that one, either. Then he continued to be exuberant and unrepentant flirts in almost every interaction, but as the evening wore on and seemingly everyone with whom they did business praised them as the prettiest couple who'd been seen here in years, it occurred to Cullen that the Verdi had done the same, both the Lemscure vendor and the coach drivers, though not the more upscale staff at the Renaissance. Without doubt they were schmoozing in the hope of sweetening every deal, but part of him had to wonder. The Verdi were clearly not a xenophobic culture, to judge by how they seemed to embrace the Nhia among them. Maybe they found this darker complexion and curly hair appealing. Obviously, cultural standards of beauty differed, and he knew nothing of those in this country, but it was difficult to imagine any standard by which Isaiah wasn't almost too lovely to look upon. Insincere or not, the constant compliments were good for his confidence, and he found himself fitting more easily into the role Isaiah seemed to want from him. Oh, Colin sought her input frequently, but at every turn it was he who decided what they would do, or see, or buy, and he who prevailed, simply by default, the few times they had a difference of opinion. The first time, he'd had to work hard to disguise his nervousness about it, but her smile was purely approving, even affectionate. In fact, her smiles only got more so, as he continued to make declarations and decisions. Always listening to her, of course. Colin didn't think he had it in him to be truly bossy, but finding himself the permanent tiebreaker by fiat was heady, unfamiliar, and as nourishing to his morale as the constant bombardment of compliments. What with one thing and another, after a couple of carefree hours, Isaiah's smiles were delivered up through her lashes, accompanied by sparkling eyes and increasingly often, an avid nibble of her lower lip. He was finding it harder and harder to keep his eyes from wandering over her. And to a lesser extent his hands, though he did still possess some semblance of Reva decorum. But keeping his arm frequently around her allowed for long caresses of her upper arm and shoulder, the curve of her waist, the arch of her spine. It was clear that their decision to cut short their excursion after a few hours, just as true night was falling, was by mutual agreement. Unspoken agreement, though, until he made the call unilaterally. And when he did she looked so proud and receptive he couldn't help himself. That kiss got them even more catcalls from the audience, and this time he couldn't find a vestige of awkwardness in himself. Isaiah was practically in his lap as soon as they climbed into a quickly hailed carriage, and fully in it by the time they reached the Renaissance. It was with deep mutual reluctance that they managed to disentangle enough to get inside and upstairs undisheveled, but they made it successfully to the door of their suite. Where it was the most Colin could do to kick the door shut before she was wrapped entirely around him. They didn't even make it and past the foyer for the first half hour. For a dragon and a godling, it seemed, a cold marble floor was as good as a feather bed. Still, the trip wasn't meant to be all fun and games. Isaiah wanted to visit her merchant contacts in the morning, but not too early. Arising with the sun, thanks to an apparently diminished need for sleep, they had time for a leisurely and frankly lavish breakfast which a diffident servant delivered to their chambers upon being summoned by the bell cord, one of which was attached to the wall in every room of their suite. Colin wasn't sure he could say the spread of fruit, pastries, eggs and heavily spiced porridge was more to his taste than the simpler street foods they'd sampled yesterday, but it was nothing if not delicious, and both were certainly preferable to hunger. After the way he'd been eating for the last year, which was to say, little and cheaply, he wondered whether all this rich food was going to make him sick, but so far there had been no sign of it. It seemed godlings were resilient in a variety of useful ways. As they were passing through the lobby after breakfast on their way to the door, they were greeted by the concierge, the same gracious older man who'd been on duty the previous day. "Good morning, my lady, my lord." He had that remarkable knack often possessed by the senior servants of powerful people, and certain government bureaucrats, who were the type in whom Colin had more often encountered it personally. That unique blend of diffidence and command, a subtle way of posture and intonation that demanded and usually received instant attention even from the speaker's betters, and yet could not be called out as presumptuous. "I trust your stay has been pleasant thus far," the man continued with a benign smile and a gesture halfway between a bow and a nod. "But of course," Isaiah assured him, "as it always is. The Renaissance has never disappointed me." "It gladdens me beyond words to hear that, my lady. I dare to hope we have made an equally favorable impression upon your lord husband." "Everything has been more than delightful," Colin said without exaggeration. "I don't think I'll ever forget the hospitality shown us during even this brief stay. You show too much kindness to our humble establishment, my lord. Tell me, have we by chance the honor of hosting you during your honeymoon? Colin blinked and turned to Izaroa, failing to process the unfamiliar term. The etymology was. Actually, he had noticed between breakfast and yesterday's snacking that the Verdi made their sweets with honey rather than cane sugar. The civil servant in him was intrigued by the implications. Cultural preference, or just economics? A northern custom, Izaroa explained to him. Newlyweds will often celebrate their nuptials by taking a recreational trip together, often embarking immediately after the ceremony. Ah. Well, then. He smiled at her, then at the concierge as she squeezed his hand, smiling back. Then I suppose we are. Not deliberately, perhaps, but I'm finding it a very fine custom indeed. Our most earnest felicitations on the occasion of your happiness, the man replied with a benign smile and another almost bow. And the humble gratitude of the house that you would grant us this privilege. If only I had known beforehand, I could have made a suitable accommodation for such an important event. Oh, we don't require any undue fuss, Colin hastened to assure him. In fact, by and large we prefer our privacy. Yes, my lord, privacy and discretion are highly valued by many of our guests, and the Renaissance is duty-bound to guarantee them. Pursuant to that, we happen to have a dedicated honeymoon suite, one more special in its accoutrements than your present lodgings, in particular its relative physical isolation from the other rooms. It is somewhat insulated by its own private gardens, an arrangement very much favored by couples celebrating a new union. And the shepherd has smiled upon you, it seems. Quite by happenstance, the honeymoon suite currently stands empty. I should be delighted to upgrade you to it for the remainder of your stay, at no additional charge, of course. Izaroa looked at him, holding her peace. Ah, right, she liked it when he made the decisions. Was this a dragon thing, or just her? He'd have to, very carefully, sound out Imaralafine and Tiavatharis. But that was a headache for another day. That's exceedingly generous, sir, Colin said, but I assure you we don't require any special accommodation. Our current suite is more comfortable than we could have hoped. I wouldn't dream of putting you to any further effort. It was almost too comfortable, in fact, at least to his sensibilities. At any rate, Izaroa had seemed satisfied, and that surely meant it was good enough for any conceivable standards. Colin was almost afraid to touch anything in there, at least when he wasn't too distracted by having her in his arms. What with one thing and another, they'd touched quite a lot last night. It is no effort whatsoever, the concierge said smoothly. The utmost comfort of our guests is the absolute baseline of the Renaissance. I could never stand before the shepherd in judgment knowing I had permitted such esteemed visitors to enjoy less than the very finest of accommodations on such an important moment in their lives. By your will, my lord, my lady, I can give the order and have your belongings conveyed to our honeymoon suite with nary an imposition to yourselves. You can proceed there directly upon returning from your outing, with the compliments of the house. Thank you, Colin said firmly, but we are comfortable where we are. Ah, yes, the house of course prioritizes your comfort above all else, my lord. Yours, and that of every guest. Though they were presently alone in the lobby, save the door attendant who stood out of earshot, he leaned forward subtly, lowering his voice. Including those staying in the suites to either side of and directly above your current rooms. All three of whom have issued complaints this morning. Shifting forward by another hair, he dropped his volume further until he spoke in a murmur barely audible even to them. About the noise. For a second, Colin just stared at him, uncomprehending. Then realization crashed down, and with it a surge of utter mortification he just barely managed to keep off his face. Mostly. He had enough poise not to cringe and hunch in on himself. He couldn't do anything about the blush. Right. The noise. Last night they hadn't given a single thought to anything but each other, just reveling in the preternatural stamina of the two kinds of magical being there were to make love in every room of the suite, and that only for starters. On nearly every piece of furniture including the keyboard, and this part almost did make him wince, In light of the concierge's comments, almost every wall. They hadn't even slept, not truly, only had naps here and there because there came moments when time spent cuddling had been just the right touch before they flowed into another round of. "Ah," said Izaroa, fortunately stepping in since Colin found himself completely tongue-tied in embarrassment. She did not look embarrassed. Just amused, and perhaps even a little smug. "I see. Husband, we have been inconsiderate." "So it would seem," he agreed, finding his voice at her gentle prompting, and very pleased to find his tone even, somewhat to his own surprise. "Well, clearly that cannot stand. You have our solemn apologies for the imposition, good sir. I thank you most humbly for your kind offer, and we shall be delighted to move to whatever chambers are most convenient for the house." "Rest assured, my lord," the concierge replied with utter aplomb, "the house has no priority save your comfort. Our only convenience is the happiness of our guests. Do please enjoy your day in the assurance that you shall have a royal welcome to our finest suite awaiting your return." Colin managed to blurt some pleasantry or other without losing the last shreds of his poise, and made as hasty a retreat as he could without visibly rushing, hand in hand with his wife, who continued to look like she found this immensely entertaining. The attendant opened the door for them, blank-faced as always, and in addition to his usual instinct to thank her in defiance of Verdi custom, this time Colin had to repress the urge to apologize. Not that she in particular had anything to do with it and likely wouldn't know what he was talking about, he just felt the need to apologize. Izaroa waited at least until they were outside and out of range of the door guard before speaking, looking coyly up at him and bumping him with her hip. "You're truly adorable when flustered, husband. I did not expect to see that. Don't worry, I won't breathe a word to the others. In fact, I find I rather wish to keep this side of you for myself, at least for a while." He let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, shooting her a somewhat less warm glance, which only made her smile wider. "You could stand to look a little less pleased with yourself." Her smile became an outright smirk, stretching to truly impressive proportions. "No, upon consideration, I don't think I could. Driver." As always, there was a convenient carriage waiting to carry them away, complete with a chatty and outgoing driver. Who, just like the others. "Why, look at this. And aren't you the prettiest pair of mortal souls I ever did see? It's a right honor to have you in my humble carriage." Funnily enough, this time Colin found it a bit less comfortable. Tope continued,